Police in Austria raid mosques suspected of recruiting fighters for Islamic groups in the Middle East. The rise of ISIL in Syria and Iraq is fueling fears of radicalization across Europe. But how much is a threat a reality or a perception? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The perception is of battle-hardened fighters returning from the front line full of anger and resentment, prepared to carry on the fight at home. Numbers vary, but it's estimated around 3,000 European citizens have taken up arms in Syria. And the UK is leading European governments in drawing up measures to combat the potential threat posed by assumed radicals. European officials have proposed a EU-wide passenger names record that would store the names of people who travel by air. France has toughened legislation to revoke passports of those suspected of being involved in terrorism abroad. And the UK has unveiled a controversial draft bill that would allow for increased surveillance and ban British foreign fighters from coming home. In its latest report, the European Union's law enforcement agency, Europol, identified what it called a growing threat from EU citizens returning from conflict zones, but added that the largest proportion of terrorist attacks, in its words, related to separatist groups. It categorized 152 terrorist attacks in EU member states in 2013, with 535 people arrested for terrorism-related offences. EU countries didn't report any attacks specifically classified as religiously inspired terrorism, again, their terminology. But Europol conceded that religious radicalization appeared to be evident in 2 attacks. That's 2 out of a total of 152. The Athena Institute, an independent research group, has charted the rise of what it calls domestic extremist groups in Europe. We see relatively few from the 70s, but a big rise in the 1990s, nationalist, separatist and liberation movements among them. And then in 2010, another upswing in the number of far-right and far-left groups. And here's what that looks like. Again, what the Athena Institute is calling domestic extremist groups in Europe, categorized from symbolic violence to a small number of groups that kill. So, how do authorities balance the perceived threat from a comparatively small numbers of fighters returning from abroad against a threat from myriad groups categorized as extremist, already established on their soil? Well, let's get the thoughts of our guests. In Paris, Mathieu Guder, professor of Islamic studies at the University of Toulouse and a specialist on religious extremism. In Amsterdam, Francesco Ragazzi, co-author of the report Preventing and Countering Youth Radicalization in the EU. And also in Paris, Mansouria Moukefi, special advisor on the Middle East and North Africa at the French Institute for International Relations. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Mathieu Guder. Well, the European governments have turned up the volume about the threat posed by returning fighters, and yet Europol statistics, as we heard, make clear that there are far greater threats, separatism, for example, that receive far less attention. Why this disparity in how governments view threat?
Actually, this is not new. This is not the first time that Europol and the European institution point out the fact that terrorism in Europe is not primarily the fact of Islamist groups or of religious-based groups. We know since years, maybe since decades, that this type of terrorism is really a minority, is really marginal, and it's not really the main threat to European. We know that the separatist groups are the major threat, especially, for example, if you take to France, especially, we know that the terrorism by separatist groups like in Corsica has the major attacks against these groups. The problem is that we are in the media and in the public opinion which is more focused on the Islamic issue, on the Islamic communities, and the melting of problems of immigration, problems of integration has turned to be confused with the issue of security and with the issue of terrorism, which makes it today very difficult to show rationally the difference between the perceived threat and between the reality of the threat on the ground.
Well, Mansuria McKefi, we heard the word there, rationally. The Europol's report appears to be rational, and yet publicly very little appears to be heard about that. Why do governments focus on one threat at the expense of others?
Well, as Mathieu just said, the perception is the most important issue here, the most important motor of the whole thing. Of course, there are other forms, other threats, other forms of terrorism and other threats. And he mentioned Corsica, but none of them appear as a security threat as the Islamic one, as the religious one. So having said that, of course, we should come back to some rationality and compare just the figures. We are, after all, talking about a few hundred, barely 3,000 young men from all over Europe. Of course, we heard that the most important figure are issued from France, but nevertheless, it's also, as I just said, just a few hundreds. But today, Islam in France and in Europe is the major is the perceived major issue, the perceived major threat. So whatever the numbers are, it remains the most important issue for this whole societies all over Europe, not only in France, but all over Europe.
Well, Francesco Ragazzi, we are stating what appears to be the obvious here, yet governments focus on legislation, as we've seen in the UK, for example, aimed at specific people traveling to specific places. Why are governments so intent on singling out the issue of religious fighters, for example, or those fighting for a religious cause? Is there some deeper reason behind it?
No, I don't think there's a really deeper reason behind it. I think this is just governments reacting to what is built up by both certain parts of the media and some other political actors as one major issue. And therefore, I think they need to be seen as doing something. In this case, I think, unfortunately for the UK, the response to the question of the foreign fighters is, again, and I will agree with the people who spoke before me, disproportionate. In fact, we've seen Denmark, for example, taking a much more sensible approach in which they will propose de-radicalization programs or different types of programs to people who are returning from Syria. I think the idea of telling directly up front to the people who want to come back that they will not be allowed in or they will be sent directly to prison is not really productive.
Well, we are going to pick up on that, the way that it is being dealt with or could be dealt with a little bit later in the show. But Mathieu Guidère, the definitions of terrorism within the Europol report is criminal acts aimed at intimidating populations, acts intended to compel states to comply with demands, and attempts to disable or destroy the fundamental structures of society. Now, those are clear definitions, but it appears to be aimed at wider groups, not individuals. And yet the focus of legislation in Europe at the moment appears to be individuals from a specific group or, in most cases, a specific religion.
Yes, this is another paradox of the European way of dealing with terrorism, actually, because these governments also are making legislations where, while they are leading a war against one and only group, which is the Islamic group, the Islamic State. So the issue of the geopolitical issue, the legislative issue are combined and lead to this problem, which is the internal politics, the interior politics and the interior agenda of the governments is being used to justify a foreign policy which is based on intervention, on a military intervention abroad. So based on this, they have to prevent from their foreign policy to prevent the security issues or the threats that can derive from their exterior political and foreign policy. And this is one of the paradoxes, is that there is absolutely no threat against the European countries, and especially France, from the Islamic State before actually the international coalition decides to intervene against the Islamic State. We know this. For example, the French government has negotiated to free journalists, French journalists, from the hands of the Islamic State before the decision of the intervention. So we know that from these groups, from these Syrian groups, from these Iraqi groups, before the decision of intervention, there was absolutely no threat against the European countries, because in the perception of these jihadi groups, the European countries and the United States has a position, a political position, that was compliant with the goals of these groups, which is the collapse of the Syrian regime. The situation has completely changed once the Western governments and the European government has decided to go with the US to fight this group. And then we created actually our own terrorists, because before that, people were leaving to fight against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. They were not willing to come back, and they haven't any agenda of attacking the European governments or the European people. Now we are in this situation that the decision of intervention in Syria and in Iraq has created the new enemy, which is the Islamic State instead of Al-Qaeda, and has turned the fighters of the Islamic State, who were fighting to construct this so-called Islamic State, they turned up into fighters against the West and into terrorist threats. And this is a real paradox which the population and the people are not aware of, since the media are focusing now on the Islamic State, and they have completely avoided and forgotten about the Syrian issue, about the war, about the Syrian regime, about what's happening on the field between other parts, other groups, and the Syrian and the Iranian and the Hezbollah and the Shiite militias and other problems on the field.
Well, Mansouriya Mokefi, there is, as appears from that statement, a direct correlation between foreign policy and domestic decision. Your view?
Yes, there is a direct correlation, and I totally agree with Mathieu, with what he said just now. However, the rise of the perception in France and in Europe is also linked to the growing visibility of the Muslims in Europe. It's also linked to the way the Syrian war and the failure to deal with it, talking about foreign policy, the failure to deal with it from the Western countries, has inflamed the imaginations and the passions of the Muslims all over the world, and also, of course, in the European Union, where, let me remind you, almost 90 million of Muslims live within the European Union borders. So this is also a very important thing to relate to foreign policy. Having said this, I would like to add that, yes, there is the major difference between Daesh agenda and Al-Qaeda agenda. Al-Qaeda agenda was primarily directed against, primarily anti-Western, where Daesh has a local and regional agenda and has wanted to devote its efforts and to develop its ambitions against the Taghut, against the tyrants in the region. But things have totally changed now, not only because of the Western intervention that Mathieu mentioned, but also because of the flux of foreign fighters in Syria.
Well, Francesco Ragazzi, you have spoken in your work about differing between types of violence. You speak about organized political violence as opposed to what you call sub-political violence, which essentially is stemming from socially isolated, alienated individuals. I want to return to that point that you brought out in terms of dealing with the issue. As you mentioned, Denmark has actually embarked on a program that provides a punishment, but also brings in the concept of prevention. It appears that what is being looked at here is a different definition of what radicalization is that radicalization or extremism is not an end. It's part of a process that can be changed at any point. I mean, your view on this?
No, absolutely. Well, first of all, I would like to mention I'm one of the co-authors of the report with Didier Bigot, Laurent Bonelli, and Emmanuel Pierre-Guité. And what we try to show in the report is that I think we should make a distinction. And I think that, well, the distinction that you mentioned now is important. On the one hand, we have, organized groups who engage in political violence. I think the term terrorism is confusing. There's many definitions of terrorism, and it's usually employed as a way to delegitimate the action of certain groups. So let's stick to the definition as political violence. There are organized groups like ETA, like IRA, like the FLNC in Corsica. They have a clear agenda. How to deal with these groups? Well, history has shown, and all the academic studies show, that eventually you will have to negotiate with them. And the best strategy is a strategy of de-escalation. In the sense in which the groups are always engaged in a relation with the state of oppression and attacks and so forth. Now, there's another kind, and this is probably the kind that we see more and more taking place now, of essentially individuals who are disenfranchised, marginalized, who are angry with society because society is not providing anymore the types of jobs, a future, or a life that they would like to have. And these people, which we found in all walks of life in Europe, are the result of essentially a certain number of disinvestments of the state in welfare policies, social policies, and so forth. So this group of people is clearly easily attracted by simple narratives, simple stories that will give them a meaning of life and that will also give them a quick solution to their problems. Now, what is often picked up here are people from Muslim background who end up in Syria. What is really less picked up is the rise of the populist groups and the rise of the extreme right, which I think should be analyzed more or less in the same frame. Now, the solution for these kind of problems, of course, there is a security aspect of the solution, but I think most of the solution has to come from a serious questioning about the dismantling of the welfare state that has been taking place over the past 20 years. And this is not certainly something that should be targeted at one particular group, as it was the case in, for example, the first version of Prevent in the UK, in which vast amounts of money were invested in social and welfare programs, but only targeted at Muslims, which I think was really counterproductive. But it should be definitely a general reasoning about entire strata of the population. Now, to go back to your question about the issue of prevention. Prevent, so the Prevent part of the counterterrorism program contest in the UK also has de-radicalization programs. They're called channel programs. Now, these programs, I think now, have been run for about more than 3,500 or up to almost 4,000 cases, and they have proven sometimes useful. Sometimes, however, they've been also quite counterproductive. I know the case, for example, of a young man of Arabic background who was attending a few demonstrations to support Palestine. And after a few of these political demonstrations, he was approached by the authorities asking whether he would enroll in a channel program of de-radicalization. So I think the boundaries of what constitutes radicalization is really a problem. And if I can just add one more element here, the whole concept of radicalization has been quite questioned in the academic circles. In fact, there was a report of the expert group on counter-radicalization by top academics commissioned by the European Commission in 2007, if I'm not wrong, who dismissed the entire concept of radicalization. There are, of course, very complex ways to understand radicalization as a process which has no deterministic type of steps. in which there's a large part that is large attention given to the social background, to the political aspects, and to the different consequences, highlighting that every case is specific. But we also have very, very sort of simplistic accounts of radicalization. And we've seen the example of this with the report of the New York Police Department, Radicalization in the West,
let's just go,
which was also a report based on much of what the
apologies
FBI
for
had,
interrupting, but I just
if I can just finish on this point.
Continue.
Mike, if I can just finish on this point. These are very simplistic accounts of radicalization, which are extremely unhelpful. And I think this is therefore the discussion about radicalization should take this into account.
Let me just go to Mathieu Gueder on this particular issue. We're hearing here an argument that is essentially saying that by focusing on a particular group within a community, one runs the risk of alienating them even further. That if you are talking about prevention, you have got to be generally focusing it on all of those who feel alienated or disenfranchised, not one particular religious or political group. Your view?
It is very sensitive to bring the issues of security and the issues of terrorism or radicalization to social reasons or psychological reasons. The social explanation and the psychological explanation does not stand most of the time, because we know we have a lot of cases where people are poor, where people are marginalized, where people are alienated, or where people are miserable. And in India and other places of the world, and even in France and in Europe, and they do not go to terrorism, they do not join radical organizations. So personally, I'm more keen to the political and ideological explanations, which means that I don't think that there is a direct link between the social or the state care situation and these issues. It's more a political issue, and it's a political issue inside the European countries. It's also a political issue outside in the Middle East. So talking about prevention means preventing whom from doing what. As for me, it's not a problem for me personally, for people leaving, because there have been always people, European people, leaving to fight somewhere in the world. Let me remind you, for example, we have French people who even went to fight in 1948 in Palestine. We have European people who went to Cuba to fight for communism. We have European people and French people who went to fight for communism and for socialism in Southern America. It was always been ideological. It has been always political. So the issue now today is not the fact why they are going there. It's about investment in revolutionary projects for them. This is their perception, and it's not our problem. The problem is, are they really going back to make attacks? Are they really, all of them, a threat to European security, to the French security, for example? Or is it a media construction about profiles? Is it the way that media frame the issue? Is it the way that the media in general, especially the Western media, frame the way these people go? Why do they go? Is it also self-proficiency fulfillment project? Because until now, we have seen absolutely no attack from any of these people going to Syria or Iraq. But now, probably, as long as we talk about it, as much as the media talk about it, we will probably end up by having the problem occurring and saying, you see, we talked about it and it's happening, while the figures are hundreds and thousands of cases of attacks of political violence all over Europe and all over the world.
Well, in that particular argument about self-fulfilling prophecies, my thanks to our guests, Mathieu Gueder, Francesco Ragazzi, and Mansuria Mokefi. And why not add your voice to this discussion? You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or contact us on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching and goodbye for now.